Cheers. And so I felt this podcast would be aptly called The Architect's Purpose, in that we're really trying to search for the nature of what it really means to be an architect in this ever-changing society, and how technology and mob think and just the overall philosophical changes, how that both impacts architecture and also impacts society as a whole, because they're basically almost one, because society inhabits, what we build. And these books will be reviewing on the first being The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, and they're all aimed at really trying to analyze these world-class or fictional, architects, and I was wondering from your class, what was the main takeaway or the main jumping off point that they really grabbed onto?
I don't know if there was a main jumping off point. There was a series of questions that I asked them, one of which was the distinction between, so Ayn Rand writes these characters that are incredibly definitive, and so if you look at Richard Keating versus Howard Roark, one of the questions I posed to the students was, is there inherent, what are the inherent differences between the two, right? And their responses were, quite varied, but it was an interesting discussion because Ayn Rand, pits these two as diametrically opposed characters. And we all know that the reality of human beings is that they're not quite that pure. They're not quite that distinctive, that there's bits and pieces of Howard Roark in some of us, and there's probably bits and pieces of Richard Keating in us. And so what does that mean, as we look at the practice of architecture, we think about the practice of architecture. So, one of the questions I posed to them was that, well, so if you think about Richard Keating, what was his motivation for what he was doing?
Mm-hmm.
And it was, he wanted to be popular. He wanted to be well known. He sought the
exactly.
He sought the admiration of society, and he did it in a way that he wasn't individualistic about it. He had to ask people and seek people's approval about things that before he formed an opinion of about something himself. He was doing the populist thing. He was giving the people what they wanted, and of course Howard Roark was the opposite of that. He knew internally what he wanted, how he wanted to do things, and it didn't matter whether society approved it or not. It was something that he had to personally achieve and pursue as an individual. And so those are the two very clear distinctions that were set up. And so I asked the students, how they felt about that. Is it, so one of the characterizations about Howard Roark was when he was, well, one of the questions I asked was, under what terms did Howard Roark agree to work for Richard Keating? And it was, he agreed to do that if he didn't do any design.
Exactly.
He said, I'll go out to the field, I'll do structural drawings, but I don't want to design because I don't want to design to the masses. I don't want to do what you're doing because for me, it's failing myself. And it's going against my, personal ethics, my personal beliefs.
And I think throughout the book, she really questions are people willing to really compromise their values for total propriety or fame, or I mean, and essentially not stick to a frigid individualist school of thought, but that doesn't even mean that one is unchanging. But it's also, what do you value? Is it all of the likes and all of the admiration, or is it that real self-worth and self-esteem and that true independence from others? Or do you really need everyone else out there and live as a second-hander?
So that's I think that that's the crux of the situation. That, when I was asking the students, I said, well, what if a client comes to you and says, I want you to build me a Tudor house? Are you going to turn them down? I mean, if you need the job, you need the money, is there something inherently wrong about doing what the client wants? And Howard Roark clearly makes the statement of, I have clients so I can build, not I build so I, you know, the reason I have clients is so I can do the buildings I want to do, not the other way
Exactly.
around. I'm not doing what the client wishes. And
Yeah.
and clearly Richard Keating was doing whatever the clients wanted. And so the question I asked them was that, as a value statement, is it wrong to do what your clients want? It's a tough
Yeah,
question, right?
because it's at one point it's tough to discuss without the actual details, but then on the flip side, it's absolutely important to have the details be completely irrelevant, because it seems it's way more on the nature of the building, and it's part of also the hubris of the hubris and the reality that these clients, if they could do it themselves, then they would just not hire you. So there has to be that element of either differentiation, but more
Well, no,
importantly,
that's not
I think
true.
improvement.
They
What do you mean?
client So some clients hire you because they already have an idea of what they want. They just need somebody with a stamp and a seal and a license to execute it. So if you made a shit ton of money doing that, is there something wrong with that? And so I related a couple of stories. One, when I was, many years ago as a younger architect, I was working for a practice where one of the principals in the firm, it was a woman, and she did these circuit cities all over the country.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and, and she just cranked them out. And I think she made like 80% profit on all of them. But yet, at the end of the day, she went home. She didn't, she wasn't waking up in the middle of the night worried about this or that. She did her job. It was a 9 to 5 deal. She went home at the end of the day and got a good night's sleep and came into the office the next day. Whereas we were working on other projects that, required, a lot more individual attention to them. And so we were staying up, all hours of the night and cranking through things, and, waking up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night thinking about a project. And so my question to my students was what she did wrong? What's the value proposition there? Or what's the value? Is there a right and wrong about it? Well, no, she loved what she did. She was
Yeah.
providing a service to the clients. And, it may not be something that I want to do, but for her, it was the right thing. It was something that she really enjoyed doing. And so there are different levels of achieving something in the profession of architecture. And you just have to find your own path. Another story I related was that, there was a young woman who was in graduate school with me who was very talented, but at the end of her graduate school, she wanted to go back to Iowa and just do these rural, regional kinds of projects that were
Mm-hmm.
meaningful for her community, but they weren't going to put her on the cover of Architecture Record.
Mm-hmm.
And so, did she, the question is, did she compromise her faith in architecture by doing that? Some would say yes, but at the same time, she was honest about what she wanted to do and true to her own
Exactly.
faith about it. And in some ways, she
Exactly.
was probably more committed to the role of Howard Roark than, people who, do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So, that's the quandary. That's the interesting thing. That's the interesting dialogue that we got into in discussing the book, is trying to, assess good and evil. Is there, is Howard Roark all good and Keating all evil? Well, I think Keating is not evil necessarily, but he was willing to not cling to a set of values himself, and was always changing with the current taste, the current feeling, whatever whatever society wanted, he was giving them. And I think that when you abandon your convictions, there's something inherently bad about that or wrong about that.
Yeah. It seems, especially in those two stories, and it's all throughout the Fountainhead as well, just that element of true self awareness and what really drives you. And in the book, she definitely argues that at least Roark's happier and Keating ends up pretty miserable. And there's a very interesting dialogue between Wynand and Roark when he's asking him basically what drives him, and it's an interesting dialogue because they both already kind of know the answer to the question, but how Roark ends up explaining how at various times he was broke, had zero pork at all. He was hated, but he didn't really care at all. He was, I mean, even whenever he was pretty much starving, it was way more about his inner self and not compromising to the earthly pleasures of being admired or what have you. And I feel she definitely tries to argue good and evil. I don't.
But I think it's good and evil, not about it's about, again, following your passions. It's about being honest
Yeah.
about those pursuits. And so, yeah, she does argue good and evil, but it's not necessarily the fact that Keating was giving the clients what they wanted. It was the fact that he was abandoning his own personal principles. And I think that's the difference. And again, you see that in Atlas Shrugged with,
Mm-hmm.
the characters that she writes in that book as well. And so whatever your values are, whatever your principles are, whatever you're passionate about, you either stick to it or you abandon it. And once you start to compromise that, then you start moving from the good side to the evil side, from the light to the dark. And I think that that's really what she's arguing.
And I feel that crux of that argument is also really spelled out whenever Keating is finally made partner, Prankon retires, it's just him, and he has a blank piece of paper. And he's like, what do I do?
What do I do now? Right.